China is fragmenting. The Zhou dynasty, once the undisputed power across the Central Plains, no longer commands fear or loyalty. Its kings still perform the ancient rituals in their capital at Luoyang, still claim the mandate of heaven, still wear the robes their ancestors wore when they conquered the Shang 6 centuries earlier. But the rituals are hollow now. The mandate is a memory. The robes are costumes worn by men who rule nothing beyond their palace walls. Real power belongs to the regional lords, the dukes and marquises who were once vassals, now sovereign in everything but name. They raise armies. They collect taxes. They wage war on one another with increasing ferocity, carving the realm into competing territories where might determines right and survival trumps tradition. The old rules, the ceremonial protocols that once bound the aristocracy into a single coherent order, are treated as suggestions at best, obstacles at worst. This is the spring and autumn period, named, ironically, after a chronicle that will record its chaos with bureaucratic precision. It is the 6th century before the Common Era. The world Confucius will be born into is not collapsing suddenly. It is eroding, year by year, ritual by ritual, murder by murder. In the state of Lu, one of the smaller territories in what is now Shandong province, the old ways linger longer than elsewhere. Lu claims a special connection to the Zhou founders. Its ruling house descends from the Duke of Zhou himself, the regent who stabilized the dynasty after conquest, who created the ritual systems that turned a military victory into a sustainable civilization. The people of Lu are proud of this lineage. They preserve ceremonies other states have abandoned. They maintain archives other courts have burned. But preservation is not power. Lu is weak, surrounded by larger and more aggressive neighbors. Its dukes are often puppets controlled by the 3 families, aristocratic clans who have slowly usurped ducal authority over generations, dividing the state's resources among themselves while the legitimate ruler presides over ceremonies he cannot enforce. Court politics in Lu are a performance of deference masking constant scheming. Loyalty is tactical. Competence is dangerous. Men of talent are either co-opted or exiled, depending on which family currently holds advantage. Into this environment, ideas about order are not abstract philosophy. They are survival questions. How do you prevent collapse when no one fears punishment? How do you maintain hierarchy when the hierarchy itself is built on violations of hierarchy? How do you convince the powerful to follow rules when breaking rules is what made them powerful? How do you restore what has been lost when the people doing the restoring are the same people who profited from its loss? These are not questions anyone is asking in the courts. The courts are busy with immediate concerns: military alliances, marriage negotiations, border skirmishes, grain supplies, the rotation of ministerial positions among rival factions. Philosophy, if it exists at all, is the domain of specialists: diviners who read oracle bones, scribes who maintain ritual protocols, musicians who perform at sacrifices. These men serve power. They do not question it. But there are others, fewer in number, less secure in position, who see the erosion and refuse to accept it as inevitable. They are minor aristocrats, junior officials, teachers without permanent posts. They believe the chaos is not natural, not the result of bad luck or divine displeasure, but the consequence of specific failures, failures of education, of character, of leadership. They believe the golden age of the early Zhou was real, not mythical, and that its principles can be recovered, studied, and applied. They are wrong about many things. They idealize a past that was never as stable as they imagine. They underestimate the structural forces driving fragmentation, economic changes, military innovations, the simple mathematics of power accumulation over generations. They overestimate the willingness of rulers to subordinate their interests to abstract principles. But they are right about one thing. Ideas outlive armies. The warlords of this era, the cunning dukes, the ruthless generals, the ministers who orchestrate coups and consolidate territories, will be forgotten except as names in chronicles. Their victories will be temporary. Their dynasties will collapse. Their descendants will be executed or absorbed into the courts of stronger rivals. Everything they build with force will be unmade by force. But the men who ask different questions, who believe that civilization requires more than coercion, who think deeply about duty and ritual and education and example, these men will shape empires they never ruled. One of them is born in Lu around 551 BCE. His family name is Kong. His personal name is Q. He will be known to his students as Confucius, Master Kong. The world will eventually know him by the Latinized version of that title, a name that carries no hint of the chaos he was born into, the failures he will endure, or the centuries of silence before his ideas become inescapable. Confucius. The details of his early life are fragments, reconstructed centuries later by disciples who turned biography into hagiography. The sources contradict one another. Dates shift. Parentage blurs. Miracles appear in some accounts, poverty in others, noble lineage in one tradition, humble origins in another. What seems clear is that Confucius is born into the lower ranks of the aristocracy, the shy class, men who occupy the bottom tier of the noble hierarchy, above commoners but below anyone who matters. The shy are too educated to be peasants, too poor to be powerful. They serve as minor officials, military officers, ritual specialists, teachers. They have status but not security. Their position depends on competence and patronage, both of which can evaporate overnight. His father dies when Confucius is young, possibly before he is born. His mother raises him in or near the capital of Lu, a city called Khufu. They are not destitute, but they are not comfortable. This matters. Confucius grows up close enough to aristocratic life to understand its workings, distant enough to see its failures without being implicated in them. He is an observer before he is a participant. He is exceptionally intelligent. This is obvious early. He has the kind of mind that does not simply memorize but organizes, that sees patterns in rituals other people perform by rote. He becomes obsessed with the ceremonies of the Zhou, the sacrifices, the music, the gestures, the arrangement of ritual vessels, the correct way to address superiors, the meanings embedded in every formal interaction. This obsession is not nostalgia. It is analysis. Confucius studies ritual the way a doctor studies anatomy. He wants to understand not just what to do, but why it works, what function each element serves in maintaining social order. He becomes convinced that the ceremonies are not arbitrary traditions but technologies of civilization, methods for transforming human impulses into sustainable relationships, for making hierarchy feel natural rather than coercive, for creating loyalty without requiring constant surveillance. But the rituals only work if people believe in them. And belief is dying. He watches the courts of Lu, where ministers bow to the duke while conspiring against him, where ancient protocols are followed in public and violated in private, where competence is less valuable than family connection. He sees men promoted for flattery, demoted for honesty, executed for embarrassing the powerful. He sees the gulf between what the rituals promise, order, stability, meritocracy within hierarchy, and what actually happens. Most people respond to this gap with cynicism. They conclude the rituals are lies, that power is what matters, that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Some become opportunists, navigating the corruption skillfully. Others withdraw, seeking personal security in a world without public virtue. Confucius responds differently. He becomes more committed to the rituals, not less. This is not naivety. He understands the corruption perfectly. But he believes the solution is not to abandon the old ways, but to recover their true meaning, to strip away the accumulated hypocrisy and restore the principles that made the early Zhou stable. He believes that civilization is always artificial, always fragile, always one generation away from collapse. The rituals are what hold it together. If they fail, the alternative is not freedom but chaos. He begins teaching. At first, his students are few. Young men from similar backgrounds, shy-class aristocrats without prospects, intelligent enough to recognize that the current system is broken, uncertain what to do about it. Confucius does not offer them techniques for getting ahead in corrupt courts. He offers something stranger, a vision of what a legitimate court would look like, what kind of men would staff it, what principles would guide it. He teaches the classics, the poetry, the history, the ritual manuals that preserve the memory of the early Zhou. But he does not teach them as dead texts. He teaches them as blueprints, as evidence that order without tyranny is possible, that rulers can govern through moral authority rather than fear, that education can create the kind of officials who make such rule sustainable. His students are learning to serve a government that does not yet exist. This is impractical in the short term. Confucius knows this. He is not building a political movement. He is not organizing a faction. He is doing something both more modest and more ambitious. He is training men to recognize good government when they see it, to refuse to serve bad government even when it is profitable, to become the kind of people who could staff a legitimate state if such a state ever emerged. He is in his 20s, then his 30s. He is brilliant, disciplined, utterly serious about things most people treat as formalities. He is also unemployed, or employed only in minor positions that do not use his abilities. He wants to serve. He wants to put his ideas into practice. He wants to prove that ritual and music and education can stabilize a state more effectively than punishment and surveillance. But no one is offering him that chance. Not yet. Confucius is not inventing a philosophy. He is excavating one. He believes the answers to the present crisis already exist, preserved in the texts and rituals of the early Zhou dynasty, particularly in the work of the Duke of Zhou, the regent who shaped the dynasty's institutions after military conquest. The Duke of Zhou is Confucius's model, not a king but a counselor, someone who wielded power without claiming the throne, who stabilized a realm through wisdom rather than force. The Duke of Zhou created a system. He divided the conquered territory among loyal relatives and allies, establishing a feudal network bound together by ritual obligation rather than bureaucratic control. He designed ceremonies that reinforced hierarchy while creating space for remonstrance, allowing inferiors to correct superiors through proper channels. He elevated music, poetry, and historical study as essential tools of statecraft, arguing that leaders who understood culture could govern without brutality, or so the texts claim. Confucius is working with sources that are already ancient, already fragmented, already subject to interpretation. He does not have access to a single authoritative canon. He has scrolls, oral traditions, ritual manuals that contradict one another, poetry collections with obscure references, historical chronicles that skip decades without explanation. He has to piece together a coherent picture from incomplete evidence, and he chooses to seek coherence. He chooses to believe that the early Zhou was genuinely stable, that its stability derived from specific practices, and that those practices can be recovered and applied. He acknowledges that the present age is degenerate, but he refuses to accept that degeneration is inevitable. The chaos is not metaphysical, it is practical. It results from specific failures. Rulers who do not cultivate virtue, ministers who prioritize profit over duty, rituals performed without understanding their purpose. The solution, therefore, is education, not technical training, not military drill, not legal scholarship. Education in the broadest sense, the cultivation of character through immersion in music, poetry, history, and ritual. Confucius believes that if you teach someone the ancient songs, train them in the correct ceremonies, make them study the decisions of past rulers, you are not just transmitting information. You are shaping their instincts, refining their judgment, making them the kind of person who will naturally choose duty over advantage. This is not about memorization. It is about internalization. A student who has genuinely mastered the rituals will know how to behave in situations the rituals do not explicitly address. A student who has absorbed the poetry will understand the emotional resonances of political decisions. A student who has studied history will recognize patterns of decline before they become irreversible. Education creates something like moral intuition, the ability to act correctly without needing a rule book for every circumstance. This distinguishes Confucius from the other intellectual currents beginning to emerge across the fragmenting Chinese world. Some thinkers are moving toward legalism, arguing that human nature is selfish and that only harsh laws with certain punishments can maintain order. They see ritual as inefficient, education as unreliable. They want to create systems that work even with bad men in charge, systems that rely on incentives and deterrence rather than moral cultivation. Others are moving toward mysticism, rejecting the entire project of social order as a distortion of natural harmony. They argue that civilization itself is the problem, that the rituals and hierarchies Confucius venerates are what corrupted humanity in the first place. They advocate withdrawal, simplicity, alignment with cosmic forces beyond human control. Confucius rejects both paths. He rejects legalism because he believes laws without moral foundation produce compliance, not loyalty. People will follow rules exactly as written and violate their spirit whenever possible. You create a society of lawyers, not citizens. The moment enforcement weakens, the system collapses. He rejects mysticism because he believes social order is not a corruption but an achievement. Humans are not naturally harmonious. They are tribal, impulsive, violent. Civilization requires cultivation. The rituals are not chains. They are the structure that makes freedom possible, the protocols that prevent every interaction from becoming a negotiation backed by force. His vision is conservative in method, but radical in implication. He is conservative because he insists the answers lie in the past, that the goal is restoration rather than innovation. He reveres the ancient texts. He treats the Duke of Zhou as an almost sacred figure. He performs the rituals with obsessive precision, correcting students who misplace a gesture or use the wrong tone. But he is radical because he believes that virtue, not birth, determines fitness to rule. He accepts the existence of hierarchy. He is not an egalitarian, but he insists that hierarchy must be justified by competence and moral character. A nobleman who lacks virtue is not truly noble. A commoner who cultivates virtue deserves respect. The goal of education is to identify and train the people who should be running the state, regardless of whether their families currently have power. This is dangerous thinking. It suggests that most of the people currently in power do not deserve to be there. It suggests that the chaos of the age is not bad luck, but the predictable result of putting the wrong people in charge. It suggests that a state staffed by educated, virtuous men, even men from undistinguished families, would be more stable than the hereditary aristocracies currently tearing the realm apart. Confucius does not present this as revolutionary. He presents it as traditional, as a return to the meritocratic ideals of the early Zhou. But the implication is clear to anyone paying attention. The current order is illegitimate. He continues teaching. His reputation grows. He is known as a master of ritual, a profound interpreter of the classics, a teacher whose students become noticeably more competent and principled than their peers. He is in his late 30s now, possibly his early 40s. He has spent decades preparing to serve. And finally, someone offers him a position. Teaching, for Confucius, is not a fallback career. It is the foundation of everything. He does not open a school in the formal sense. There is no building, no institution, no fixed curriculum. Students come to him, sometimes individually, sometimes in small groups. They are young men, mostly from the shy class, though a few come from wealthier families seeking something they cannot find in the conventional court education. They study with Confucius for months or years, then move on to positions in various states, carrying his ideas with them. The process is intimate. Confucius tailors his teaching to each student's temperament and abilities. Some need discipline, others encouragement. Some grasp principles quickly but lack patience for detail. Others master the rituals perfectly but miss the underlying logic. He pushes them, criticizes them, refuses to let them settle for competence when they are capable of mastery. He teaches through the classics, but the classics are not the end point. They are tools for developing judgment. When students study the Book of Songs, an ancient collection of poems and hymns, they are not learning to recite verse. They are learning to recognize emotional states, to understand how music and language shape perception, to see how rulers in the past used poetry to communicate values and build cohesion. A student who has absorbed the songs will understand the political implications of a festival, the danger in a court's failure to maintain ritual music, the way culture binds a society more effectively than force. When students study history, they are learning to recognize patterns of rise and decline. They examine decisions made by past rulers, trace the consequences across decades, identify the moment when a state began its collapse. They learn that chaos does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. A ruler promotes the wrong minister. That minister appoints his relatives. Those relatives prioritize personal profit. Revenue declines. Military readiness weakens. Neighboring states probe the borders. Within 2 generations, the state is conquered or torn apart by internal factions. The goal is to train men who can see these patterns developing and intervene before collapse becomes inevitable. Confucius is also teaching something harder to quantify, a way of being in the world. He calls it ren, often translated as humaneness or benevolence, but the word is more complex than that. Ren is the quality that makes someone fully human rather than merely clever. It is the capacity to care about others not as tools or obstacles, but as people, to feel the weight of duty without needing punishment to enforce it, to act with integrity even when no one is watching. Ren cannot be taught through lectures. It is cultivated through practice, through years of performing rituals until the gestures become second nature, through studying texts until the examples of virtuous men become internal reference points. A person with Ren does not calculate the right action in each situation. They feel it. They have internalized the principles so deeply that virtue is instinctive. This makes Confucius's teaching slow. There are no shortcuts. A student cannot master Ren by reading a manual or memorizing rules. They must live with it, practice it, fail at it, correct themselves, try again. The process takes years, sometimes decades. Some students never fully grasp it, but the ones who do become different kinds of men. They are still ambitious. They still want positions in government. But their ambition is constrained by duty. They will not serve a ruler who violates moral principles, even if the position is lucrative. They will remonstrate with a superior who makes a bad decision, even if it costs them favor. They will resign rather than implement a policy they believe is unjust. This is not idealism. It is professionalism. Confucius is training officials the way a master craftsman trains apprentices. He is teaching them standards. A good carpenter does not build a chair that looks acceptable from one angle, but collapses under weight. A good official does not implement a policy that produces short-term stability but guarantees long-term chaos. In both cases, the standard is objective. You can compromise on it, but you cannot pretend the compromise is excellence. The problem is that most courts do not want excellent officials. They want loyal ones. A truly competent minister will tell a ruler things the ruler does not want to hear. He will point out when a military campaign is doomed, when a tax policy will cause rebellion, when a favorite advisor is corrupt. He will do this because his duty is to the state's long-term stability, not to the ruler's short-term comfort. But most rulers experience this as insubordination. Confucius is training men for governments that do not exist yet. His students graduate, if that is the right word, and enter service in various states. Some thrive. They find positions under rulers who value competence, who are willing to listen to honest counsel, who understand that good governance requires constraining their own impulses. These students send word back to Confucius, reporting on conditions in distant courts, asking for advice on specific dilemmas. Others struggle. They refuse appointments under unworthy rulers and remain unemployed. They accept positions and then resign when asked to implement policies they consider unjust. They remonstrate too forcefully and are dismissed or exiled. A few are executed. Confucius does not tell them to compromise. He also does not tell them to become martyrs. He teaches them to assess each situation carefully, to serve when they can be effective, to withdraw when they cannot. The goal is not purity. It is efficacy. A man who refuses every imperfect situation accomplishes nothing. But a man who accepts every position becomes complicit in the very decay he is supposed to be preventing. It is a narrow path. most of his students walk it imperfectly. Confucius himself is still walking it. He is in his 40s now, recognized as a master teacher, respected by a small network of intellectuals and officials, but not powerful, not influential in the way that matters. He has students in multiple states, but no state has made him an advisor. He understands ritual better than almost anyone alive, but his expertise is decorative. Courts consult him on ceremonial details, then ignore him on policy. He wants more than consultation. He wants implementation. He wants to prove that a state governed according to Zhou principles, staffed by educated and virtuous officials, can outcompete the naked power politics currently dominating the age. He wants to demonstrate that ritual is not weakness, that moral authority is not naivety, that education creates better governance than fear. He needs someone to give him the chance. The opportunity arrives when Confucius is around 50 years old. The details are murky, as always, filtered through sources that want to emphasize either his competence or his humility, depending on the agenda of the chronicler. What seems to have happened is that political circumstances in Lu shifted, temporarily, in a direction that made Confucius useful. Lu is still controlled by the three families, the Jisun, Mengsun, and Shusun clans, who have spent generations accumulating power at the expense of the legitimate ducal line. The duke himself is a figurehead, performing rituals while the families make decisions. But the families are also rivals, engaged in constant maneuvering against one another, and occasionally one of them calculates that bringing in an outsider, someone without family loyalties, might be strategically advantageous. Confucius is that outsider. He is appointed to a position in the Lu government. The exact title varies depending on the source. Some say he was made Minister of Crime. Others say Minister of Works. Still others suggest he held a junior position and was later promoted. What matters is that he is finally inside, finally in a position to implement ideas rather than just teach them. He approaches the work with the same intensity he brought to studying ritual. He believes that good governance is not about clever policy, but about example. A ruler who is personally virtuous will inspire virtue in his ministers. Ministers who are virtuous will inspire it in local officials. Local officials will inspire it in the population. The moral character of the leadership cascades downward, shaping behavior more effectively than laws or punishments. This is not mysticism. It is a theory of how social systems function. People observe the powerful and adjust their behavior accordingly. If the powerful are corrupt, corruption becomes normalized. If they are disciplined, discipline becomes expected. If they perform rituals carelessly, no one takes the rituals seriously. If they perform them with precision and reverence, the rituals regain their authority. Confucius therefore focuses on the ruler's conduct. He advises the Duke of Lu, or whichever member of the ruling families is willing to listen, on the proper performance of ceremonies, on the importance of maintaining personal discipline, on the need to promote men based on competence rather than family connection. He is not lecturing about abstract virtue. He is giving practical advice about how to stabilize a government that is visibly fraying. And, for a brief period, it seems to work. Lu's administration becomes more orderly. Appointments are made with greater care. Ceremonies are performed with renewed attention to detail. There is a sense, at least among Confucius and his students, that the state is recovering its dignity, that the chaos can be reversed, that the principles of the early Zhou are not fantasies, but viable strategies for governance. But the Improvement is fragile. Confucius is not actually in control. He is an advisor, a minister, possibly a talented one, but not the head of the Jisun family, not the commander of the army, not the person making the decisions that truly matter. He can influence, but he cannot command. And the people who can command are playing a different game. The three families tolerate Confucius because his reputation adds legitimacy to the government. His presence suggests that Lu values virtue and scholarship, that the state is something more than a prize to be divided among aristocratic clans. This is useful for public relations, both domestically and in dealings with neighboring states. But they do not actually intend to follow his advice when it conflicts with their interests. Confucius begins to realize this. He watches as competent men are passed over for promotion because they lack the right family connections. He watches as ceremonial reforms he recommended are implemented in public but ignored in private. He watches as the families consolidate their power further, using the legitimacy he provides as cover for actions that violate everything he believes about proper governance. He is being used. This is humiliating, but the humiliation is not the point. The point is that his presence is making things worse. By lending his reputation to a government he cannot actually reform, he is helping maintain an illegitimate system. His students look to him as an example of how virtue can succeed in politics, but what they are actually seeing is how virtue can be co-opted, neutralized, turned into decoration. Confucius faces the central dilemma of his life. If he resigns, he loses his only chance to implement his ideas. He proves the cynics right, that ritual and virtue are irrelevant in real politics, that power is what matters, that educated men should either play the game or withdraw into irrelevance. If he stays, he becomes complicit in a system he opposes. He provides legitimacy to rulers who do not deserve it. He teaches his students that compromise is always necessary, that you must work within the system even when the system is fundamentally corrupt. There is no good answer. Confucius chooses to stay for a while. He continues advising, continues trying to influence decisions at the margins, continues hoping that incremental improvements will accumulate into something larger. He is not naive about what is happening, but he believes that withdrawing entirely is worse than accepting limited efficacy. Then something happens that makes the choice for him. The specifics are disputed, as always. One account says the Duke of Lu attended an interstate meeting where he was humiliated by the ruler of a neighboring state, and Confucius, as an advisor, was unable to prevent it. Another says the three families conducted a ceremony in a way that violated ritual propriety, and when Confucius objected, he was ignored. A third account, more colorful, claims that a neighboring state sent Lu a gift of beautiful dancers, and the Duke became so distracted by them that he neglected his duties. What matters is the realization. He cannot succeed here. The government of Lu is not interested in reform. It is interested in stability on its own terms, which means maintaining the power of the three families, performing rituals for show, and keeping the Duke compliant. Confucius is valuable to them as a symbol, not as a counselor. And symbols do not change policy. Confucius is in his mid-50s. He has spent decades preparing for this opportunity. He has sacrificed material comfort, social standing, the ease of a conventional career. He has trained students, mastered the classics, refined his understanding of governance. And it is not enough. He resigns. The resignation is not dramatic. There is no public confrontation, no angry denunciation, no speech about principles betrayed. Confucius simply leaves. He steps away from his position in Lu, gathers a small group of his most committed students, and begins traveling to other states, looking for a ruler who will take his ideas seriously. He is a man in his mid-50s, which in the 6th century BCE is old, visibly old, with whatever opportunities youth provided now behind him. But he is not ready to retire into irrelevance. He believes that somewhere in the fragmenting Zhou world there must be a ruler intelligent enough to recognize that moral authority produces more stable governance than fear, that ritual creates loyalty more effectively than surveillance, that educated officials outperform opportunists in the long term. He will spend the next 14 years searching. This period of Confucius's life, the years of wandering between states, seeking employment, offering counsel, being rejected or ignored, is the most documented and the most mythologized part of his biography. Later traditions will turn it into a heroic journey, a sage bringing wisdom to a benighted world. But the reality, as much as it can be reconstructed, is grimmer. Confucius is a political refugee with credentials. He travels with a small entourage, students who have chosen to follow him rather than pursue conventional careers, perhaps a few servants, minimal baggage. They move from state to state, Wei, Song, Zheng, Chen, Kai, Chu. Sometimes they are received politely by local rulers who grant them audiences, listen to Confucius's advice, and then do nothing with it. Sometimes they are ignored entirely. Sometimes they are treated with suspicion, seen as potential spies or troublemakers. The pattern repeats. Confucius arrives at a court. He is introduced, usually through one of his students or former students who has found a position there. He meets with the ruler or with senior ministers. He is asked about governance. He gives his answer. Cultivate virtue, perform rituals with sincerity, promote men of talent regardless of birth, prioritize education over punishment, lead by example rather than coercion. The rulers nod. They agree that virtue is important. They praise the ancient ways. They acknowledge that the current age is troubled. And then they continue governing exactly as they did before. This is not because they are stupid. Many of these rulers are intelligent, capable men navigating genuinely difficult situations. They are surrounded by powerful families, threatened by neighboring states, managing internal factions that could explode into civil war at any provocation. They need military strength, diplomatic cunning, administrative efficiency. They need officials who can collect taxes, generals who can win battles, ministers who can manage complex alliances. What they do not need is a ritual specialist telling them to be better people. Confucius understands this. He is not oblivious to political reality, but he believes the rulers are misdiagnosing the problem. They think they are managing a series of immediate crises, this border dispute, that succession struggle, this harvest failure. But the crises are symptoms of a deeper dysfunction, the collapse of the moral framework that makes governance legitimate. Without that framework, every solution is temporary. You win a war, but your soldiers become warlords. You raise taxes, but officials embezzle the revenue. You execute a rival, but his family seeks revenge. You enforce order through fear, but the moment your attention shifts, chaos returns. Confucius is offering a structural solution. Rebuild the framework. Restore the rituals. Educate the officials. Create a government where people follow rules because they believe in them, not because they fear punishment. But structural solutions take time, and rulers do not have time. In Wei, Confucius is treated well initially. The ruler seems interested. But Wei is caught between larger powers, and the ruler's attention is consumed by military strategy. Confucius is consulted on ceremonial matters and ignored on policy. In song, he is nearly killed. The details are vague, but it seems that local officials see him as a threat, possibly because his presence attracts students who might otherwise serve those officials, possibly because his ideas implicitly critique their corruption. There is an incident, possibly an assassination attempt. Confucius and his students have to flee. In Zheng, they are separated. Confucius waits for his students at a city gate, alone, looking increasingly like what he is, an old man without a position, without a patron, without a future. Someone sees him there and describes him, in a phrase that will be preserved, as looking like a stray dog. The description is not entirely unsympathetic. Stray dogs are persistent, but they are also homeless, scavenging, dependent on scraps of attention from people who might kick them as easily as feed them. Confucius does not argue with the description. He repeats it to his students later, possibly with amusement, possibly with bitterness. He continues traveling. In Chen, he finds temporary refuge. The ruler is more sympathetic, or at least more patient. Confucius stays for several years, teaching, advising on minor matters, hoping that the relationship will deepen into something more substantial. But Chen is weak, and weak states cannot afford to follow idealistic policies. When Chen is threatened by a stronger neighbor, Confucius becomes a liability, a foreign intellectual whose presence might offend the aggressor. He moves on. In Kai, he and his students run out of provisions. They are not welcome, not expelled, just neglected. Food becomes scarce. The students are hungry, possibly starving. Some of them question whether this journey is worth continuing. They have sacrificed careers, comfort, security to follow a master who has led them to poverty and irrelevance. Confucius does not reassure them with empty promises. He acknowledges the suffering. But he insists that the alternative, compromising with corrupt rulers, accepting positions in illegitimate governments, is worse than hunger. This is the test. Not whether his ideas are true, but whether they are worth holding when they cost you everything. Some students stay. Others drift away, accepting positions in states Confucius will not serve, deciding that survival trumps principles. Confucius is now in his 60s. He has been wandering for years. No state has implemented his ideas. No ruler has proven wise enough to govern through virtue rather than force. The chaos he set out to remedy is intensifying. The wars are becoming more brutal. The rituals are decaying faster. He has failed. The roads between states are not safe. This is not a unified empire with maintained highways and military patrols ensuring traveler safety. This is a world of fractured territories, each controlled by whoever can hold them, with borderlands that shift based on the outcomes of skirmishes and the changing loyalties of local strongmen. Bandits operate with impunity. Armies move through regions, requisitioning supplies and leaving devastation. Refugees from failed states wander in groups, desperate and dangerous. Confucius and his students are moving through this landscape. They are not well funded. They do not have military escort. They are a small group of intellectuals traveling with scrolls and ritual implements, exactly the kind of target that makes sense to rob. Valuable enough to be worth the effort, weak enough to pose no threat. They survive through a combination of caution, connections to former students now serving in various courts, and luck. The experience is radically different from court life. In a palace, Philosophical questions are abstract. You debate whether human nature is good or evil, whether ritual or law is more effective, whether the ancient kings were genuinely virtuous or simply clever. The debates are sophisticated, sometimes brilliant, but disconnected from consequence. You can hold any position without having to test it. On the road, philosophy becomes practical. When you have not eaten in 3 days, the question of whether virtue or survival takes priority is not theoretical. When you encounter soldiers who might be bandits, the question of whether you can govern through moral example rather than force gets answered immediately. When your students are exhausted, hungry, and questioning whether this journey has any purpose, the question of what holds a community together when external incentives fail becomes urgent. Confucius is living inside the chaos he has spent his life trying to solve. And what he observes, over and over, is that force dominates when no one believes in legitimacy. The states they pass through are governed by fear. Rulers maintain power by making examples of disobedient subjects, by keeping subordinates divided and suspicious of one another, by ensuring that everyone is complicit in the system and therefore unlikely to challenge it. This works in a narrow sense. It produces compliance. But it produces no loyalty, no resilience, no capacity for collective action beyond what can be coerced in the moment. When a ruler dies, the state often collapses into succession crisis. When an army suffers a defeat, soldiers desert en masse. When a drought or flood disrupts agriculture, there is no social cohesion to manage the crisis, just competition for increasingly scarce resources. Confucius is witnessing the failure mode he predicted, but he is also witnessing his own irrelevance. He cannot stop the violence. He cannot persuade the rulers he meets to change course. He cannot offer his students the positions or security they deserve. All he can do is keep moving, keep teaching, keep insisting that there is a better way even as the evidence around him suggests otherwise. The students who remain with him during these years are extraordinary. They are not there for career advancement. They are not there because following Confucius is easy or comfortable or likely to lead anywhere productive. They are there because they believe in something larger than their own survival, not in a mystical sense, but in the concrete sense that civilization is worth preserving, that the rituals and texts and principles Confucius has taught them represent something real, something that matters even when no one in power cares about it. These students are experiencing what Confucius has been teaching in theory, that duty persists even when inconvenient, that virtue is its own justification, that the right action is right regardless of outcome. But they are also human. They complain. They question. They get frustrated with Confucius when his rigidity makes their situation worse. There is an incident, preserved in fragments, where they are traveling through a region controlled by a warlord who has a personal grudge against Confucius. Possibly because Confucius criticized him years earlier. Possibly because one of Confucius's students offended him in some forgotten context. The warlord sends soldiers to intercept them. Confucius and his students are detained, not quite arrested, but not free to leave. The students are afraid. They believe they might be executed. Confucius remains calm. He is old now, visibly frail, but his composure is unshaken. He tells them that heaven has entrusted him with preserving the culture of the Zhou, and that if heaven intends for that culture to survive, then they will not be killed. If heaven does not intend for it to survive, then being killed will not matter. This is either profound faith or profound fatalism, depending on perspective. The students are not entirely reassured, But they watch Confucius, and his calmness is contagious. They wait. Eventually, the warlord decides they are not worth the trouble and lets them go. But the incident crystallizes something. Confucius is not going to succeed in the conventional sense. He is not going to find a ruler who implements his ideas. He is not going to reform a state. He is not going to see his vision realized in his lifetime. What he can do is preserve the ideas, keep teaching, keep the texts intact, keep training students who will carry the principles forward, even if those students never hold power, even if the chaos continues for generations. This is a different kind of ambition. Most people want to see their work succeed. They want validation, impact, the satisfaction of knowing their efforts mattered. Confucius is being forced to accept that he will not get that satisfaction. He is planting seeds in soil that might not be fertile for a century. He continues, traveling through his 60s. The journeys become shorter as he ages. The group moves more slowly. They spend longer periods in the states that tolerate them, accepting minor teaching positions, advising on ceremonial matters, surviving on whatever patronage they can secure. Confucius is no longer trying to reform governments. He is documenting the tradition. He begins organizing the classical texts more systematically, editing and annotating them, clarifying their meanings for students who will need to understand them without direct access to the oral traditions that are rapidly disappearing. He is doing the work of preservation, making sure that the principles of the early Zhou are recorded clearly enough that a future generation, if one ever emerges that cares about such things, will be able to reconstruct them. This is archival work. It is unglamorous. It does not feel like changing the world, but it is the work that will matter. The warlords Confucius has met, the rulers who ignored him, the ministers who saw him as a threat or a curiosity. All of them will be forgotten except as names in chronicles. Their states will be conquered, their families extinguished, their policies reversed. But the texts Confucius is editing, the students he is training, the principles he is clarifying, these will survive. He does not know this yet. He cannot know it. From his perspective, he is an old man who failed at his life's purpose, reduced to teaching a handful of students who themselves have no prospects, preserving traditions that a violent age has no use for. But he continues the work anyway. There is a period, somewhere in the middle of his wandering years, when Confucius and his students are trapped between warring states. The exact location is uncertain. The sources say they were traveling from Chen to Kai, or possibly from Kai to Chu, through territory that was contested by multiple powers. What matters is that they were caught in a region where no one was in control, where armies might appear without warning, where local populations were hostile to outsiders who might be scouts or spies. They ran out of food. Not gradually. There was no slow rationing, no careful management of declining supplies. They simply reached a point where the provisions were gone. The villages they passed through had nothing to sell or refused to trade with strangers, and the roads were too dangerous to send anyone foraging. They were stranded, and they were starving. The students stopped being philosophical about their situation. Some became angry, blaming Confucius for leading them into this predicament. Others became despondent, wondering if they would die there, unremembered, having sacrificed everything for ideas that no one valued. A few became sick from hunger and could barely walk. Confucius did not have answers. He could not produce food. He could not make the situation safer. All he could offer was the same thing he had always offered: the insistence that their suffering had meaning, that preserving the way was worth the cost, that acting with integrity in impossible circumstances was more important than survival. The students were not consoled. One of them, the sources say it was Zilu, one of his most loyal followers, confronted him directly. The challenge was something like, does the superior man also endure poverty? Does virtue protect against hunger? If the way is true, why are we suffering while corrupt men prosper? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that emerge when theory meets reality, when the gap between what should happen and what does happen becomes unbearable. Confucius answered carefully. He acknowledged that yes, the superior man endures poverty. Virtue does not guarantee material success. The way does not protect you from suffering. The difference is that the superior man endures poverty without losing his principles, while the small man, when poor, becomes reckless. This is cold comfort when you are starving, but it is honest. Confucius is not promising that virtue will be rewarded, that heaven protects the righteous, that suffering is temporary or redemptive. He is simply stating that if you believe civilization requires more than force, if you believe that legitimacy matters, if you believe that education and ritual create better governance than fear, then you must live according to those beliefs even when it costs you everything. Otherwise, you are admitting that the cynics are right. The students were quiet. Some accepted the answer, some did not. But they stayed. Eventually, the situation resolved, not through any action of Confucius, but through changing military circumstances that made the roads passable again. They reached the next state, found food, recovered. The crisis passed, but the memory remained. Confucius was teaching them something that could not be taught in a classroom, that principles are only real when they are tested, that integrity is only meaningful when it is expensive, that the difference between philosophy and performance is whether you hold to your beliefs when no one is watching, and nothing is rewarding you for it. This is why his students, the ones who stayed, became different from other educated men of their era. They were not more intelligent. They were not more skilled in administration or military strategy. But they had been broken and had chosen not to compromise. They had faced the question, is this worth it? In circumstances where the answer was genuinely uncertain, and they had decided yes. That decision changed them. When they eventually took positions in various governments, they brought with them a standard that was independent of their employer's approval. They would serve competently, but they would not serve unjustly. They would advise honestly, even when honesty was dangerous. They would resign rather than implement policies they believed would harm the state. This made them difficult employees, but it also made them valuable in ways that opportunistic officials could never be. A ruler who wanted actual stability, who understood that short-term cleverness often produces long-term catastrophe, could trust these men. Their loyalty was not to the ruler personally, but to the principles the ruler was supposed to embody. Confucius was creating a class of officials who could outlast dynasties. But in the moment, none of this was clear. In the moment, they were just hungry men on dangerous roads, following an old teacher who had led them nowhere. The years of wandering blurred together. State after state, court after court, the same pattern of polite reception and practical irrelevance. Confucius was respected as a scholar, admired as a teacher, consulted on ceremonial details. But he was not given power. He was not allowed to implement his vision. He was in his late 60s now. His health was declining. The travel was harder. The students who remained with him were aging too, and many had families they had not seen in years, careers they had abandoned, opportunities they had sacrificed. Confucius could no longer pretend this journey would end in success. The rulers were not going to change. The states were not going to adopt his principles. The chaos was intensifying, not abating. The spring and autumn period was sliding toward even greater violence, toward the era that would later be called the Warring States, when the pretense of Zhou legitimacy would be abandoned entirely, and naked conquest would be the only law. He had spent 14 years wandering. He had proven nothing except that virtue without power is impotent. It was time to go home. Confucius never wrote a systematic treatise. He never organized his ideas into a formal philosophy. What we know of his thinking comes from fragments, sayings recorded by students, anecdotes preserved in later compilations, teachings reconstructed from multiple sources that sometimes contradict one another. But beneath the fragments, there is a coherent vision. Confucius believes that human beings are not naturally orderly. They are tribal, impulsive, capable of great cruelty when their immediate interests are threatened. Left to themselves, without structure, they form small groups bound by kinship and mutual fear, constantly competing for resources, unable to cooperate beyond the scale of a village or clan. Civilization is the technology that allows humans to cooperate at scale. But civilization is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It is always one generation away from collapse because the behaviors that sustain it, deference to authority, respect for ritual, willingness to prioritize long-term stability over short-term gain, are not instinctive. They must be taught, practiced, reinforced. This is why education matters. Not education as technical training, but education as moral cultivation. The goal is to create people who have internalized the principles of social order so deeply that they follow them without needing external enforcement. People who feel shame when they violate duty, who feel pride when they perform rituals correctly, who derive satisfaction from serving something larger than themselves. Confucius calls this cultivation. The Chinese term is junzi, often translated as gentleman or superior person, but the concept is not about social class. A junzi is someone who has been shaped by education and ritual into a person capable of governing themselves, and by extension others. The cultivation process is gradual. It begins with the study of classical texts, poetry, history, ritual manuals. These texts are not just information. They are training tools. By studying the poetry of the early Zhou, a student learns to recognize and articulate complex emotional states. By studying history, they learn to identify patterns of rise and decline. By practicing rituals, they learn discipline, precision, and the capacity to subordinate personal impulse to social form. Over time, these practices reshape the student's instincts. A person who has genuinely mastered the rituals does not experience them as constraints. They experience them as the natural way to behave. Bowing to a superior is not humiliating. It is correct. Performing a sacrifice with precision is not tedious. It is satisfying. Maintaining social hierarchy is not oppressive. It is the structure that makes cooperation possible. This is what Confucius means by ren, the quality of full humanity. It is not kindness in the sentimental sense. It is the capacity to act in accordance with social roles without needing constant supervision, to feel duty as a positive motivation rather than a burden. A society of people with Ren does not need harsh laws. This is the key insight that separates Confucius from the legalists who are beginning to emerge in other states. The legalists believe that human nature is selfish, and that only strict laws with certain punishments can maintain order. They design systems that assume bad actors and try to make those systems work through incentives and deterrence. Confucius finds this approach fundamentally flawed. Laws create compliance, not virtue. People follow laws exactly as written and violate their spirit whenever possible. A legal system must constantly expand, adding new rules to cover new forms of evasion, creating a bureaucracy of enforcement that itself becomes corrupt. And the moment enforcement weakens, during a succession crisis, a military defeat, an economic collapse, the entire system falls apart because no one actually believes in it. Ritual, by contrast, creates internalized order. When people genuinely believe in the rituals, when they have been educated to see hierarchy as legitimate, when they derive satisfaction from performing their social roles correctly, you do not need constant enforcement. The system is self-sustaining because the people within it want it to continue. This is why Confucius insists on music and ceremony. Music is not decoration. It is a tool for shaping emotional responses, for creating shared experiences that bind communities together. When a population participates in the same festivals, sings the same songs, performs the same sacrifices, they develop a common identity that transcends kinship. They become citizens of a state rather than members of competing clans. Ceremony is not empty formalism. It is the physical practice of hierarchy and duty. When you bow to a superior, you are rehearsing deference. When you perform a sacrifice, you are practicing precision and reverence. When you participate in a state ritual, you are enacting your place in the social order. Over time, these practices become habitual. They shape how you think about yourself and your obligations. But the system only works if the people at the top are virtuous. This is the crucial weakness in Confucius's vision, and he knows it. If the ruler is corrupt, if the ministers are self-serving, if the rituals are performed cynically, then the entire edifice collapses. Education cannot create virtue in people who are determined to be vicious. Rituals cannot command respect when the people performing them are obviously hypocrites. Music cannot bind a community when the community recognizes that its leaders are liars. The solution, therefore, is to ensure that only virtuous men hold power. This is where Confucius becomes radical, though he presents it as conservative. He insists that virtue, not birth, determines fitness to rule. A nobleman who lacks moral character is not truly noble. A commoner who cultivates virtue deserves respect and responsibility. The goal of education is to identify talent wherever it exists and train it for governance. This implies a meritocracy, at least within the educated class. Confucius does not advocate for democracy or equality. He accepts hierarchy as necessary, but he insists that hierarchy must be earned through demonstrated competence and moral cultivation, not inherited through accident of birth. The aristocracy should be an aristocracy of virtue, constantly replenished by promoting talented men from lower ranks. This terrifies the hereditary nobility. It suggests that most of them do not deserve their positions. It suggests that their power is illegitimate if they have not cultivated virtue. It creates a class of educated men, Confucius's students, who believe they are more qualified to govern than the people currently in charge. And they are probably right. But being right does not give them power. And without power, their virtue is irrelevant. This is the tragedy Confucius cannot escape. His vision requires virtuous rulers who will voluntarily constrain their own behavior, promote competent subordinates even when those subordinates critique them, and prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. Such rulers are rare. Most rulers want loyal subordinates, not competent ones. They want officials who will implement their decisions without question, who will flatter rather than correct, who will help them accumulate power rather than constrain it. Confucius is offering them something they do not want, accountability, so they ignore him. And the chaos continues. By the time Confucius reaches his late 60s, he has become a figure without category. He is not a ruler. He is not a minister in active service. He is not a recluse who has withdrawn from politics entirely. He is something stranger, a man who remains deeply engaged with questions of governance but has no government, who trains officials for states that do not exist, who preserves traditions that the present age has abandoned. He is living proof that his ideas do not work, and simultaneously that they might be the only thing worth preserving. The students who remain with him during this period are not there for practical reasons. They are there because they have come to see Confucius himself as a kind of embodied argument, a demonstration that integrity is possible even in impossible circumstances, that you can maintain standards when no one rewards you for it. He teaches constantly. Even in his wandering years, even when he has no formal position, he gathers students wherever he goes. They come to him because his reputation has spread, not as a successful minister, but as a master of the classics, someone who understands the ancient texts more deeply than anyone alive, who can explain not just what the rituals are, but why they matter. His teaching method has refined over decades. He does not lecture abstractly. He responds to specific situations, specific questions from specific students. One student needs to learn restraint. Confucius emphasizes caution and reflection. Another needs to learn courage. Confucius emphasizes action and decisiveness. He tailors the teaching to the person, recognizing that different temperaments require different guidance. The sayings that will later be compiled into the Analects, the primary text preserving Confucius's teachings, emerge from this process. They are not systematic philosophy. They are contextual responses, practical advice given to individuals in particular circumstances. This makes them sometimes contradictory, sometimes puzzling, but also deeply human. Confucius does not pretend to have all the answers. When students ask him about metaphysics or the afterlife, he deflects. His concern is human society, not cosmic speculation. When asked about serving spirits, he says something like, "If you cannot serve men properly, how can you serve spirits?" When asked about death, he responds, "If you do not understand life, how can you understand death?" This is not evasion, it is focus. Confucius believes that the urgent problem is social collapse, and that social collapse has practical causes that can be addressed through education, ritual, and virtuous leadership. Spending time on unanswerable questions about the nature of the universe is a distraction from the work that needs to be done. But he is also honest about uncertainty. When he does not know something, he says so. When the classics are ambiguous, he acknowledges the ambiguity. When historical records contradict one another, he presents both accounts. This intellectual humility is part of what makes him credible to his students. He is not a prophet claiming divine revelation. He is a scholar trying to understand difficult texts and apply their wisdom to a chaotic world. The students debate among themselves what to make of him. Some see him as a tragic figure, a brilliant man born in the wrong era, whose ideas would have flourished in the early Zhou, but are irrelevant in the present age of naked power politics. Others see him as a prophet, someone whose message will eventually be recognized even if the current generation cannot understand it. Still, others see him simply as a teacher, someone who has mastered a craft and is passing it on without any grand historical destiny. Confucius himself seems uncertain. He makes occasional comments suggesting he believes heaven has entrusted him with preserving the Zhou culture, that there is some larger purpose to his suffering, but he also expresses frustration, doubt, the sense that he has failed. He is human enough to want success, to want validation, to want to see his ideas implemented before he dies. He does not get that satisfaction. What he gets instead is a growing network of students scattered across multiple states, men who carry his teachings with them into whatever positions they manage to secure. They do not control governments, but they influence decisions at the margins. They serve as advisors, ritual specialists, local administrators. They apply Confucian principles in small ways, resolving disputes through mediation rather than punishment, promoting competent subordinates, maintaining ceremonial standards even when their superiors are indifferent. This is not the transformation Confucius hoped for, but it is not nothing. The ideas are spreading, slowly, through personal relationships rather than institutional adoption. When one of Confucius's students takes a position in a new state, he brings Confucian ideas with him. When that student trains his own students, he passes on the teachings. The transmission is informal, decentralized, fragile. But it is happening. Confucius is creating something like an intellectual tradition without institutions. There is no Confucian Academy. There is no official endorsement. There is no textbook or fixed curriculum. What there is a loosely connected group of educated men who share certain assumptions about governance, who have studied the same classical texts, who approach political problems with similar frameworks. They disagree among themselves about specifics. Some emphasize ritual more than others. Some are more willing to compromise with imperfect rulers. Some focus on inner cultivation, others on practical administration. But they share enough common ground that they can recognize one another, that they see themselves as part of a tradition. This tradition has no power, but it has persistence. The warlords and ministers who dominate the political landscape are not building traditions. They are building personal power bases that will collapse when they die or when a stronger rival defeats them. Their legacies will be measured in territory controlled, battles won, rivals destroyed, all temporary achievements that will be reversed within a generation. Confucius and his students are building something slower and more durable. A set of ideas about how to govern, transmitted through education, preserved in texts, embodied in the practices of men who may never hold high office but who will not forget what they were taught. Confucius is in his late 60s. He has been traveling for more than a decade. He is tired. His health is failing. The work of preserving the tradition, editing the texts, training the next generation of students, this work is not finished, will never be finished, but it needs a stable location. He decides to return to Lu, not because Lu has reformed, not because anyone there is offering him a position of real authority, but because it is home, because the archives are there, because the students who still want to learn from him need a place to find him. He goes home to finish the work. The return to Lu is quiet. There is no official reception, no acknowledgement of his years of service or decades of teaching. He is simply an old man coming back to the state where he was born, where he once held a minor position in government, where he still has a few connections and former students. He is allowed to return because he is no longer a threat. When he left Lu in his 50s, he was dangerous, a man with ideas, with influence, with the potential to challenge the established order. Now, in his late 60s, visibly aged and weakened by years of travel, he is simply a teacher. The three families that control Lu's government have no reason to fear him or to prevent his return. Confucius understands this. He is not returning with any expectation of political influence. He is returning to do the work that cannot be done while wandering, organizing the classical texts, systematizing the teachings, ensuring that the tradition he has spent his life cultivating will survive him. He establishes himself in Khufu, the capital of Lu, and students come to him. Some are young men beginning their education. Others are former students returning for advanced instruction. A few are officials in nearby states who come periodically to consult with him on ritual matters or historical questions. The teaching continues, but the tone has shifted. Confucius is no longer preparing students for immediate political careers. He is preparing them for a future he will not see, for the possibility that someday, in some state, a ruler will emerge who wants to govern justly and will need educated men to help him do it. This is preservation work, archival work, the work of maintaining knowledge through a dark age. He focuses particularly on the classical texts. The Zhou dynasty's literary heritage exists in scattered, incomplete forms. There are poetry collections that have been transmitted orally, with variants between different regions. There are historical chronicles that skip decades, that contradict one another, that reflect the biases of whichever state produced them. There are ritual manuals that assume knowledge no longer widely held. Confucius begins the work of editing and organizing. He is not inventing these texts. He is selecting from existing materials, choosing which versions to preserve, which poems to include, how to arrange them, what interpretations to emphasize. This is enormously influential work, because the versions he creates will become the canonical versions, the ones that later generations study. He organizes the Book of Songs, selecting poems that illustrate proper emotions and social relationships. He edits the historical chronicles, creating a narrative of the spring and autumn period that emphasizes moral causation, showing how states rise when rulers are virtuous and decline when they are corrupt. He clarifies ritual procedures, ensuring they can be practiced correctly even without direct oral transmission. This work is technical, unglamorous, and essential. Without it, the Zhou tradition would fragment completely, would become a collection of local customs with no coherent principles. With it, there is a foundation for future scholars to build on, a set of reference texts that preserve not just information but a way of thinking about governance and society. Confucius is creating the infrastructure for a tradition that does not yet exist institutionally, but might someday. His students during this period see a different side of him. He is no longer the vigorous teacher of his middle years, pushing students hard, traveling constantly, seeking opportunities to implement his ideas. He is older, slower, more reflective. He talks about the past more, about the early Zhou, about the Duke of Zhou, about the principles he has spent his life trying to recover. But he is not merely nostalgic. He is still intellectually engaged, still refining his understanding, still teaching with precision and demanding high standards. When a student misinterprets a text, he corrects them. When a ritual is performed carelessly, He insists it be done again correctly. The work continues. He is also mourning. Some of his closest students have died. Some have taken positions in distant states and will not return. Some have disappointed him by compromising too much, accepting service under rulers Confucius considers illegitimate. The community that sustained him during the wandering years is fragmenting, and his family is gone or distant. His wife, if he had one in any meaningful sense, is either dead or long estranged. His son, Kong Li, is not particularly distinguished, competent but not brilliant, dutiful but not passionate about the tradition his father has devoted his life to preserving. Confucius is surrounded by students but fundamentally alone. He is also increasingly aware that he will not see his work succeed. The chaos is intensifying. The states are larger now, more organized, more militarized. The pretense of Zhou authority is nearly gone. The period of relatively restrained warfare is ending, giving way to campaigns of total conquest. The future looks darker than the past. Confucius spends his final years editing texts, teaching students, and waiting. Not waiting for political opportunity. He knows that will not come. Not waiting for vindication. He has no expectation of seeing his ideas adopted. Just waiting for the work to be finished enough that it can be transmitted, for the tradition to be stable enough that it might survive the coming storm. He is in his early 70s now. His health is declining noticeably. He moves more slowly, tires more easily, speaks more quietly. The students watch him carefully, aware that they are losing him, uncertain what will happen to the tradition when he is gone. Confucius does not reassure them with grand promises. He tells them to continue studying the texts, to teach others, to serve when they can do so with integrity, to withdraw when they cannot. He tells them that the way will survive if heaven wills it, and that their job is simply to do the work regardless of outcome. It is the same message he has always given them, but now it sounds like a farewell. Confucius dies in 479 BCE, at the age of 72 or 73, depending on which chronology you trust. The sources say he became ill and died relatively quickly, surrounded by students. There are no dramatic last words, no deathbed revelations. He simply weakens and stops. The students mourn him according to the ritual protocols he taught them. They observe the proper mourning period, wear the correct garments, perform the ceremonies with the precision he would have demanded. This is both genuine grief and final demonstration of what he spent his life teaching. That form matters. That ritual transforms raw emotion into something socially productive. That civilization persists through these practiced gestures. But they are also uncertain what happens next. Confucius left no formal organization. There is no academy, no institution, no designated successor to carry on his work. What there is a loose network of students, some of whom studied with him for decades, others for only a few years. They have copies of the texts he edited, notes on his teachings, memories of his interpretations of the classics. Some students begin compiling his sayings, gathering the fragments they remember into collections that will eventually become the Analects. Others continue teaching, taking on their own students, spreading the tradition further. A few take positions in governments, trying to implement Confucian principles in whatever limited ways their positions allow. The tradition does not disappear when Confucius dies, but it also does not triumph. For the next several centuries, Confucianism is one intellectual tradition among many, respected by some, ignored by most, in constant competition with other philosophies that seem more immediately practical. The states are moving toward a centralized bureaucratic administration, toward legalist systems that rely on laws and punishments rather than ritual and education. Confucian scholars are employed, but usually in minor, positions, as ritual specialists or tutors, not as policymakers. The ideas survive, but they do not dominate. What Confucius could not know, dying in 479 BCE, is that the chaos he witnessed was just beginning. The spring and autumn period would give way to the Warring States period, 2.5 centuries of intensifying violence culminating in the Qin dynasty's brutal unification of China. The Qin would implement pure legalism, harsh laws, mass executions, book burnings, the deliberate destruction of the classical tradition Confucius worked to preserve. But the Qin would last only 15 years. The dynasty that replaced it, the Han, would need a different governing philosophy. Legalism could conquer, but it could not sustain legitimacy. The Han rulers needed something that could justify their rule beyond force, that could create loyalty across a vast empire, that could provide a moral framework for bureaucratic governance. They turned to Confucianism. Not immediately and not completely. The Han dynasty was founded in 206 BCE, more than 2.5 centuries after Confucius died. By then, his teachings had been preserved, refined, and adapted by generations of scholars. The Confucianism that became state orthodoxy under Emperor Wu in the 2nd century BCE was more systematized, more ritualized, more integrated with cosmological speculation than anything Confucius himself taught. But the core ideas were his. Governance through moral example, the importance of ritual and education, the belief that virtue rather than birth should determine fitness to rule, the insistence that civilization requires constant cultivation. These ideas became the foundation of Chinese imperial governance for 2,000 years. The civil service examination system, which selected officials based on their mastery of Confucian texts rather than aristocratic lineage, was a direct implementation of his vision. The emphasis on ritual propriety, on maintaining ceremonial forms, on using music and poetry as tools of statecraft. All of this came from the tradition Confucius preserved. He never saw any of this. He died believing he had failed. But he left behind something more durable than political success: a set of texts, a network of students, and a vision of what legitimate governance could look like. That vision outlasted every warlord who ignored him, every dynasty that fell, every empire that rose and collapsed. This is the paradox of Confucius's life. He was powerless. He had no army, no wealth, no political position of real authority. He spent his final years editing texts and teaching students, work that seemed marginal even to many of his contemporaries. He died without seeing his ideas implemented, without any clear evidence that his life's work had mattered. But ideas compound differently than power. The warlords had armies, but armies disperse when their general dies. The ministers had wealth, but wealth is plundered or redistributed. The dukes had territory, but territory is conquered and absorbed into larger states. Everything built on force was temporary, was already eroding even at the moment of its greatest strength. Confucius built on education, on texts that could be copied, on students who could teach others, on principles that could be applied in different contexts by people he would never meet. This kind of influence is slow to develop, but extraordinarily difficult to destroy. The books were burned repeatedly by various dynasties trying to erase the past, but people had memorized them. The students were scattered, exiled, sometimes executed. But they had trained others. The ideas were suppressed, dismissed as impractical, out of date, irrelevant to the real work of governance. But they persisted, because they were answers to permanent questions. Confucius won because the questions he asked do not go away. How do you create political legitimacy without relying solely on force? How do you maintain social order without turning governance into permanent surveillance? How do you build institutions that outlast individual rulers? How do you train officials who will act with integrity even when no one is watching? These are not ancient questions. They are structural questions that every civilization confronts. And the answers matter because the wrong answers produce collapse. Confucius understood something that the warlords of his era did not. Force is expensive. You can conquer territory with an army, but then you have to garrison it. You can execute rebels, but then you have to monitor for new rebels. You can extract taxes through threat of punishment, but then you need tax collectors, and those collectors need supervisors, and the supervisors need investigators to ensure they are not embezzling. Every act of coercion requires infrastructure to sustain it, and that infrastructure is a permanent cost. Legitimacy is cheaper. When people believe a government deserves to rule, they comply voluntarily. They pay taxes without needing armed collectors. They resolve disputes through official channels instead of private violence. They defend the state when it is threatened because they see it as theirs. This is not mystical. It is practical. A state with legitimacy can operate with a fraction of the enforcement apparatus that a purely coercive state requires. Confucianism provided a technology for generating legitimacy. The rituals were not decoration. They were repeated public performances that reinforced hierarchy while making that hierarchy feel natural, even sacred. The emphasis on education created officials who had internalized the standards of governance and could be trusted with discretion. The insistence on moral example meant that rulers had to constrain their own behavior, which made the system seem fair, even when it was unequal. This is why Confucianism became state orthodoxy under the Han and remained central to Chinese governance for 2 millennia. It was not because emperors were personally virtuous or because bureaucrats genuinely cared about the common good. It was because Confucian principles made the system more efficient, more stable, more capable of managing a vast empire with limited communication and transportation technology. But the ideas were also genuinely compelling. Confucius articulated something that people wanted to believe, that society could be organized around something better than naked power, that duty and ritual and education mattered, that competence should be rewarded, that rulers had obligations to the ruled. These ideas gave meaning to the lives of the scholar officials who staffed the imperial bureaucracy, who spent decades studying for examinations, serving in provincial posts, trying to implement policies that would improve people's lives. The system was never as meritocratic as Confucius imagined. Wealth still mattered. Family connections still mattered. Corruption was endemic, but the ideal existed as a standard against which actual governance could be measured and criticized. Reformers could appeal to Confucian principles to argue against abuses. Officials could resist unjust orders by citing their duty to the people rather than to the emperor personally. The tradition gave them language for resistance. This is why authoritarian governments keep trying to suppress Confucianism and keep failing. The ideas are too useful. You cannot run a large, complex society purely through force. You need educated officials. And once you educate them, once you teach them that governance has moral standards, once you give them texts that articulate those standards, you have created the intellectual tools for critique. Confucius would have been surprised by this legacy. He was not trying to create an ideology for empire. He was trying to restore the Zhou dynasty, to recover a lost golden age, to convince small state rulers to govern virtuously. He thought locally. He could not have imagined his ideas being systematized into state orthodoxy, being used to justify imperial rule, being studied by millions of students for thousands of years. But the core insight was scalable. Civilization is fragile. It requires cultivation, and the people who do the cultivating need to believe the work matters. That is why Confucius still matters. Not because his specific policy recommendations are relevant. The world he was trying to restore is gone. The rituals he obsessed over are museum pieces. The political problems of the spring and autumn period are not the political problems of the present. But because the underlying challenge remains. How do you build a society that is more than just competing power blocks held together by threat of violence? How do you create institutions that people believe in? How do you train officials who will act with integrity? How do you maintain civilization when the incentives favor short-term extraction over long-term stability? Confucius did not solve these problems. No one has solved these problems. They cannot be solved permanently because every generation inherits them fresh, confronts them in new contexts, has to decide whether to do the hard work of cultivation or accept the easier path of cynicism. But Confucius demonstrated that the work is possible, that principles can survive without power, that education and ritual and moral example are not fantasies but tools, slow tools, often ineffective tools, but the only tools that build anything lasting. He died a failure by every conventional measure. But the rulers who ignored him are remembered only because they appear briefly in the texts his students preserved. The states that rejected him collapsed and were absorbed into empires that eventually adopted his ideas. The warlords who commanded armies are footnotes. The teacher who edited texts shaped a civilization. That is why Confucius won.